Chapter 10. Wings of Vietnam. The season had shifted to autumn over a month ago. With persistent heavy rains that lasted all day, tiny raindrops drifted softly in the gusts of wind. The large alder tree in front of the house, which typically had lush foliage during the summer, had shed its last yellow leaves the week before. The little squirrels with their beautiful long gray tails, curled up like feather dusters, charmingly ran around the yard, seemingly sensing the approaching cold of winter, and had since disappeared. Wrapped in a thick warm coat, Tuan sat on the rocking chair on the porch. The steaming cup of coffee beside him, along with the morning cigarette in his hand, made him feel as though time had slowed down. Since moving here, most of the bad habits associated with the four pleasures had been temporarily discarded, not just by him, but by almost everyone he knew who seemed to have fallen into the same unique routine. Tuan no longer smoked at work or inside the house as he used to in Vietnam. However, on weekends when friends came over to chat, he liked to enjoy a few cigarettes to sweeten the conversation. Perhaps the old saying of our ancestors was very accurate: a cigarette and a betel nut are the beginning of a conversation. With a hot cup of coffee on a cool autumn morning like today, or a cold beer with foam in the scorching summer, a cigarette between the fingers seems to complete something essential in life. Tuan did not intend to glorify or promote the image of smoking, thinking it might make a man appear more elegant or romantic, because his wife often nagged him about lung disease, the stink of smoke on clothes in the house, and so on. But old habits die hard, and her words were like water off a duck's back. He would sneak out to have a puff to avoid the nagging. After finishing the last sip of coffee, Tuan stood up, intending to turn around and open the door to go back inside, when he heard the sound of a car turning toward his house. Tuan paused and looked out toward the alley, squinting through the drizzle to see if the visitor was familiar or a stranger. Before he could clearly identify the person, the car had already stopped in front of the garage. The driver's side door opened, and a man in his 50s stepped out. Tuan easily recognized the visitor. Overjoyed, he called out, "Hey Trung! Today you're driving a new car. I thought it was some stranger. Last Saturday, my wife prepared some snacks waiting for you, but you never showed up." "Oh, last week I was busy with some errands in Seattle. When I got home, my wife told me you had called. Never mind, let's put that aside. Today I have a new friend with me. I'm not sure if you remember him." Tuan was still unsure when the passenger side door opened. A man around the same age stepped out and nodded in greeting. Just as Tuan was about to step outside to greet the guest, he froze in surprise, unable to say a word. Trung approached and patted his shoulder, hinting at something. "Do you recognize him?" Tuan didn't answer Trung's question directly. Instead, he continued to gaze at the guest, mumbling, "Is that really Tam?" The guest stepped forward, seemingly able to read the surprise in Tuan's eyes. "Yes, it's me, Tam." Overwhelmed with emotion, Tuan extended his arms to embrace Tam. "Oh my God! It's been over 20 years since we last met." To respect the emotional and surprising reunion, Trung quietly stepped inside the porch. Hearing the sound of the car stopping and the unfamiliar voices outside, Phuong opened the door to see the three men still chatting excitedly. She quickly called out Tuan, "Why don't you invite the gentleman inside? It's cold out there." As if snapping back to reality, Tuan quickly urged, "I was so happy to see Tam that I forgot about the cold. Let's go inside." Turning to Phuong, who was waiting by the door, Tuan introduced his wife. "You already know Trung, but do you recognize this gentleman?" Phuong widened her eyes, trying to recall if she had met this guest before. She shook her head apologetically. "You have so many friends, I can't remember them all." Tuan smiled mischievously at his wife. "Of course you wouldn't know. This is Tam, an old acquaintance of ours. Do you remember the story I once told you about my cousin's younger sister, La, in Pleiku?" As Tuan mentioned this, Phuong's face lit up and she eagerly interrupted, "Oh, is this the Tam who was Lee's husband?" Tam had been standing quietly since Phuong opened the door. He now stepped forward and bowed slightly. "Yes, that's me, ma'am." Phuong's expression suddenly turned sad and she bowed her head, sighing, "Poor La." Tuan didn't want to dwell on the past sadness between Tam and La, so he intentionally changed the subject. It's too cold out here. Let's go inside and have a little drink to celebrate Tam's arrival in the States. Tuan was a former captain in the Air Force of the Republic of Vietnam. He was assigned as an air liaison officer to the 2nd Corps Tactical Zone Headquarters, stationed in Pleiku. It was at this new unit that he met Captain La Von Tam, who had been transferred from the 2nd Air Division in Nha Trang to work together in the Joint Air Operations Office, coordinating between the Army and the Air Force. At that time, both Tam and Tuan were still single, so the two friends lived together in the bachelor officer's quarters. Occasionally, on days when the persistent rain in Pleiku kept them indoors, Tam would recount to Tuan the bittersweet love story between him and Lone, as well as the hardships of his orphaned childhood. The more they lived together and got to know each other, the closer they became, like brothers. One such bond led to an occasion during the quiet New Year's holiday in the dreary town, where Tuan introduced Tam to his cousin's younger sister, La, who lived in Pleiku. That spring in the border town of Pleiku seemed warmer and more joyful than usual. The bright yellow apricot blossoms appeared to bloom in celebration of a new love that had just begun. Spring passed, summer arrived, and then autumn came. On some weekends, during the long, drizzly rains of the highlands, people would see a couple walking closely together under the eaves of the street. She would often stop to watch the rain bubbles floating on the surface of the water, and a gentle sadness would suddenly come over her, as those bubbles would soon burst and disappear into the flow of water. Fate is the law of God that all living beings must implicitly accept as an undeniable reality that cannot be explained or understood. No matter how intelligent or exceptionally talented humanity may be, each individual must ultimately submit to the divine arrangement of fate. After President Nguyen Van Thu ordered the abandonment of strategic positions in the provinces of Ban Mi Thuot, Kontum and Pleiku, Tam was transferred to the 4th Air Division, Can Tho, while Tuan was reassigned to the Bien Hoa Air Base. The day they parted ways when leaving Pleiku was also the final farewell between the two. About 6 months later, Tam was imprisoned by the communist forces to pay the price for being a defeated national soldier. More fortunate, Tuan and his family managed to leave Saigon on the afternoon of April 30, 1975, aboard a naval ship at the Bac Dang River port. After many days of transition during their time as refugees, his family eventually settled in Portland, Oregon. In the early years, Tuan made inquiries about Tam, but none of the old friends he was able to contact knew whether Tam was still alive or had perished after the communists took control of the South. Over time, the name La Von Tam gradually faded from his memory, only occasionally brought up as part of the sad love stories that had occurred within Tuan's extended family. After everyone had settled into the living room, Phuong turned to her husband and whispered, "They probably haven't had breakfast yet. Can you help me by going to the garage and getting some packets of instant noodles from the box on top of the refrigerator? I'll make some shrimp noodles for them, and then I'll go to the market to buy beef to make shaking beef with bread for later." Before Phuong could finish her sentence, Trung stepped in and said, "Hey Phuong, don't go through all that trouble. I actually plan to come early to invite you and Tuan, along with Tam, out to the street to have some pho." Phuong didn't seem to agree. "Are you saying my cooking isn't good enough, Trung?" Trung shook his head, trying to explain, "That's not what I meant at all. Everyone here knows that you're a great cook, especially when you make appetizers. They're the best. I just didn't want to trouble you. You guys only come over occasionally. It's no trouble at all. Besides, today we have Tam here, so you should stay and chat. Going out in the cold rain will ruin the fun." As if she suddenly remembered something, Phuong added, "Oh, I forgot to ask, why didn't you bring your wife Thao with you today, Trung? Why are you going solo?" "My wife was a bit busy at home today, so I came to bring Tam over to visit you both." At that moment, Tuan came in carrying the box of noodles and placed it on the table. Phuong turned and went to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. Tuan and Trung had only known each other for about 15 years, and their friendship began by chance at a mutual friend's house. Trung had escaped from a communist prison after being transferred from the north back to the south during the Vietnam War. He later fled by boat and made it to the United States. When Tuan learned that Trung was a former major and L-19 reconnaissance pilot in the Air Force, the same branch as him, he frequently took his family to visit Trung and help him get settled in the early days. From then on, they became close friends. After handing the box of noodles to Phuong, Tuan returned to the living room and with a slightly puzzled expression asked Trung, "Hey Trung, I'm a bit confused. How did you meet Tam? And how did you know that Tam had a connection to my family and bring him here?" Trung didn't answer right away. Instead, he smiled as if keeping a secret. "What's so hard about that? Don't you remember? The world is round like a ball. You walk around and eventually you meet at some point, just like ants circling the rim of a bowl." Tuan was a bit annoyed by Trung's roundabout way of starting the conversation. "I've heard your ant-circling philosophy before, but it's dragging on too much. Just get straight to the point already." Trung, still maintaining his calm demeanor, laughed heartily. "Slow down, man. Why are you in such a rush, like the girls in the old cow hang neighborhood? My wife loves me because of my easygoing nature. But if I tell the story, it won't be as interesting. Let Tam tell it, he'll do a better job." Trung then turned to Tam and said, "Go ahead and tell your brother-in-law. He's eager to know." Tam, who had been sitting quietly, finally spoke up. "Trung just wants to tease you, Tuan. The truth isn't that complicated. I've known Trung since our school days in the Ban Co neighborhood of Saigon. It was Trung who introduced me to the Air Force Pilot Officer Training Program in NHA Trang. And after that, as you know, President Thu ordered the tactical withdrawal from Pleiku. I was transferred to the 4th Air Division in Can Tho, while you were reassigned to the 3rd Air Division in Bien Hoa. Since then we lost contact. A few months later, the situation changed rapidly, and the country unfortunately fell into communist hands. The entire ARVN dissolved overnight like foam on water. Trung and I happened to meet again under bitter circumstances in a communist prison. We were in the same camp where they classified us by rank. About a month later, they moved Trung to another place. I later found out they took him to the north while I remained in the south. Around that time, I tried to inquire about you and Uncle and Aunt Hai, and I was told that your family had left long ago. Later, I came to the United States under the HO humanitarian program and have been renting a place in the southern part of Seattle for over 4 years now. Just yesterday afternoon, by chance, I took my wife grocery shopping and ran into Trung, who was also shopping with his wife in Seattle." As Tuan listened intently to Tam recount the old story, his eyes suddenly widened in surprise, and he interrupted the conversation. "Wait, Tam, you're married?" "Yes, I'm married now," Tam replied. He paused for a moment, lowering his head as if trying to hide a sad memory resurfacing from the past. Tuan, more than anyone, understood the beautiful love story between La and Tam during their time in a poor border province. Tuan had also witnessed a horrifying scene on the road between Pleiku and Ban Mi Thuat. A mine exploded, flipping a bus onto its roof, its wheels still smoking. Many bodies were laid out on the road, including a young woman who had just died, her eyes still wide open, as if in regret or waiting for a loving hand to gently close them so she could peacefully depart. Tam arrived just in time, and La finally closed her eyes to say goodbye to everyone. She ascended higher and higher, like a cloud drifting toward an unknown sky, where surely there would be no war and no human hatred. After a moment of emotion, Tam composed himself and looked directly at Tuan. "Do you still remember, Lone?" Still puzzled by the news of Tam's marriage, Tuan was caught off guard by Tam's question. "Lone? Which Lone?" "The Lone whose photo I used to show you when we were living together in the bachelor quarters in Pleiku." As if suddenly remembering events from over 2 decades ago, when they were young Air Force officers assigned to 2nd Corps and lived together in the camp, Tuan responded, Oh, I remember now." Lone had long, silky black hair and beautiful dove-like eyes. "She was the neighbor girl you mentioned, right? Your memory is still pretty sharp," Tam replied. "But you said back then that she had moved away, lost contact, And you couldn't find her anymore, didn't you? Tam's face lit up with happiness as he turned to Trung, who was sitting nearby. You were right, Trung. The world may be big, but you keep circling around and you'll meet again. It proves your ant circling the rim of a bowl philosophy is 100% accurate. Seeing Tam side with him, Trung chimed in, See Tuan? I'm never wrong. Tam is my witness. Knowing Trung's love for jokes and teasing, especially now that he had an ally, Tuan pretended to concede. All right, senior officer, I admit defeat to your superior ant-circling philosophy. Now please shut up and let Tam talk. Stop jumping in and spoiling everything. Tam continued the story about himself and Lone, explaining how a series of coincidences led to them meeting again, and ultimately how fate brought them together as husband and wife. Although busy cooking in the kitchen, Phoong was still listening to the conversation between the three men in the living room next door. When Tam finished recounting the difficult journey he and Lone had been through, from their first meeting in their school days to the many years of suffering and sorrow that followed, Phoong stepped into the living room and sat down next to her husband. Tam's story is so sad, it made me want to cry. Tam turned to Phoong. I'm sorry for making you sad. I didn't want to bring up old memories, but since Tuan and Trung, who are like family, wanted to know, I shared my personal story with them. Sensing the room had become quiet and somber, Tuan decided to change the subject. Hey, have you finished cooking the noodles? We're hungry here. They're ready. I've set them on the table, still hot. Now come join us for breakfast. Oh, by the way, Tam mentioned earlier that Lone is currently at home with Thou, right? Yes, that's right, Phoong. The reason I didn't bring Lone here to visit you and Tuan is that she requested that I come alone first to have some freedom. She'll come visit later. Tuan gently patted his wife's shoulder. How about we go to Trung's house this afternoon to visit them and get to know Lone? I agree, but we should ask Trung and Tam if it's okay. Tam remained silent, but his glance at Trung indicated there would be no issues for him or Lone. Sensing his friend's intentions, Trung cheerfully said, You're both very welcome to visit. I'll call my wife and let her know to prepare. Phoong playfully teased, Trung, you're making it seem like we're strangers, having to notify your wife in advance, like preparing for a presidential visit. No, it's not like that. I just want to remind her to pick up some cilantro, okra, and fresh fish from the market so Lone can make sour fish soup and caramelized fish in a clay pot for you two to enjoy some authentic Khao Mau dishes this evening. You're going to trouble them again. Hearing about sour fish soup and caramelized fish, Tuan's face lit up with excitement and he winked at Trung. Stop being difficult. Don't make Trung change his mind now. Pretending to reassure his wife, Tuan then turned to Trung and whispered, Hey, I love that dish. Call home and tell them to get ready. I've got a brand new bottle of Hennessy I haven't opened yet. I'll bring it over to your place this evening and the three of us can drink and unwind. Khao Mau has long been famous as a source of fresh fish and crabs in southern Vietnam. The jars of fragrant fish sauce made from snakehead fish after the draining of ponds, creeks, or fields have become one of the well-known specialties in Vietnam. The girls of Khao Mau, with their long silky black hair, graceful sun-kissed skin, and gentle demeanor, dressed in ao ba ba and tilted conical hats, hiding their half-smiles, have captivated and enchanted many city boys. Often Tam's old friends, knowing he married a girl from Khao Mau, would tease him. Khao Mau is easy to go, but hard to return. Boys go with a wife, girls return with a child. Lone was born and raised in a well-off real estate business family in Saigon. As an only child, she was dearly loved and spoiled by her parents. Her mother, a smart and exemplary woman in the family, did not let her affection for her daughter detract from her teaching Lone the virtues of Kong Dung Nan Han, work, appearance, speech, and conduct, which she believed were important virtues especially for women. Her mother's view on being a wife and mother was simple. To her husband she was a companion, a comfort, an encouragement, and a support whenever needed. To her child, she was like a towering tree providing much-needed shade throughout life. Aside from her regular work at school or the office, Lone often helped her mother with cooking and various household chores. So after Lone and Tam got married and moved out on their own, she, like her mother when she still lived with the family, paid close attention to her husband's favorite meals and ensured he had restful sleep after tiring workdays. Tam had noticed this many times and deeply cherished his wife, silently thanking heaven and earth for granting him such an intelligent, kind, and virtuous partner. After a delicious dinner cooked by Lone herself, with a pot of sour soup made from fresh snakehead fish heads, fragrant with rice, paddy, herbs, and basil, along with a pot of caramelized catfish in pepper and a bowl of fish sauce with chilies, everything appeared simple and rustic, yet the art of cooking and seasoning the soup and the meat was nearly perfect. Everyone praised it heartily. Tuan was the first to speak. Lone, back in the day when I was still in the military, I would occasionally stop in Rach Gia for lunch during operations because it was rumored that the sour snakehead fish soup there was the best. But now I see that the sour fish soup and caramelized fish from Ca Mau are truly number one, and Rach Gia has to take second place. Tuan's flattering words made everyone laugh heartily. Phuong, sitting next to him, chimed in. Tuan is right, Lone. He almost had a wife in Rach Gia, but when he returned to Bien Hoa, he married me because he couldn't resist the sweetness of Bien Hoa pomelos and forgot his way back. Tuan playfully patted his wife's shoulder. Hey, you can say that again. Was it sweet pomelos, or did someone eat a sour one and end up with a numb tongue? Then he turned to Trung. Hey Trung. Tam fell for the sour fish soup and caramelized fish from Ca Mau. I was seduced by the pomelos of Bien Hoa, so what got you? Trung pretended to think, then looked at his wife. Do you remember what got me, honey? Thou looked at Trung and gave him a sideways glance. Was it something that got you, or something you got? Those two verbs have different applications, you know. Tam, who had been sitting quietly, noticed that Trung was about to get into trouble, so he interjected to help his friend. Trung was almost right, thou. See, I got thrown into prison, and that's how I met my wife. If I hadn't been imprisoned, who knows what I would have gotten in the future. Everyone burst out laughing at Tam's light-hearted reasoning. Thou joined in the laughter and shook her head. You Air Force guys have a way with words, you can talk your way out of anything. Tam didn't miss the opportunity and continued while Thou was still pondering. Everyone here knows each other's secrets, so what are you still hiding, Thou? Share your story to make it fair. At this point, Phuong and Lone also started teasing Trung. See Trung? Lone got Tam with sour fish soup and caramelized fish, and I hooked Tuan with Bien Hoa pomelos. You two must have had a very romantic relationship, so why are you still keeping it a secret from us? Realizing they were being cornered, Thou finally gave in. All right, I surrender. If we had had a golden time to get to know each other before the war, like you all did, that would have been the best. But Trung and I met during the hardships of escaping by boat with nothing to spare. The truth is that after the communists transferred prisoners from the north back to the south, during a moment of negligence by the communist guards, Trung managed to escape from the group of prisoners. He hid, and eventually made his way back to his family home in the Ban Co neighborhood of Saigon. Fearing local police and nosy neighbors, Trung's mother arranged for him to stay temporarily with an old friend who was now a fish wholesaler in Go Kong, while they planned his escape by boat. During this waiting period, Trung disguised himself as a laborer, helping to unload fish from the boats when they returned from the sea and distributing the fish to buyers who came to take them to the market. At that time, Thou was the youngest daughter of Mr. Hai, the owner of the fish wholesaler, and she handled the financial aspects of the business. Thou was just 20 years old, and she had two brothers who had served in the ARVN. One was a Navy lieutenant who had escaped to the United States by ship on April 30, 1975, and the eldest brother was a battalion commander in the Rangers who died in action at Dong Zoi during the fierce summer of 1972. Mr. Hai was old and often ill, compounded by his grief over the loss of his eldest son. Not long after, he passed away. The fish wholesaling business was left to Mrs. Hai and Thou to manage. Several times, local administrative officers requested that she sign over the business to the state cooperative, but she resisted, knowing that sooner or later the business would be taken over by the communist government, the assets her husband and she had built through their hard work since the birth of their first son. A little over a month ago, Mrs. Hai and Thou secretly received a letter from her second brother, sent from the United States through Europe. He advised his mother and sister to sell all their assets and hire someone to build a boat to cross the sea to Malaysia or the Philippines, and he would arrange for them to be sponsored to the United States. Mrs. Hai was hesitant, uncertain about the method and the route, so she procrastinated. Now, with Trung's help, she saw this as a great opportunity for the family. Mrs. Hai and Trung's mother had been very close friends when they were in school and later in life, so she treated Trung like her own son, and Thou saw Trung as an elder brother in the family. Mrs. Hai trusted Trung and gave him full authority to secretly arrange for the construction of a boat for their escape. Not wasting any time, Trung found and connected with Mr. Bay Heen in the Khao Noi neighborhood. Mr. Bay was a skilled craftsman who specialized in building large offshore fishing boats. After negotiating the price, dimensions, and load capacity, Mr. Bay promised to expedite the work within 3 months. The boat would be powered by a new GM 3-block engine from the United States. The remaining tasks for Trung included purchasing fuel, drinking water, and provisions for about 70 people for a 15-day journey. This was the number of people planned for in Mrs. Hai's family to take on this trip. Although Trung was a former Air Force major and reconnaissance pilot, navigating maps and compasses was not a problem for him. However, he was concerned about potential engine trouble, so he carefully recruited a former Navy mechanic, Sergeant Nguyen Ngoc On, who had served in the Coastal Patrol Fleet in the 4th Corps Tactical Zone and was very familiar with the local seas. Trung promised to take On's entire family on the trip for free. With everything arranged and kept in strict confidence, the plan was considered solid. The fish wholesaler continued to operate as usual, with no signs of any impending departure. Trung, still shirtless in shorts, continued to help load and unload fish at the dock. To gradually liquidate valuable real estate, Mrs. Hai often mortgaged or sold properties to wealthy individuals in the province. Sometimes, after selling, she had to lease back the property for a few months to continue using it temporarily, leading many to believe her business was in decline and she was selling off assets to pay debts. With the proceeds, she discreetly purchased gold bars, storing them in fish sauce jars buried underground. The N7 day arrived, and Mr. Bay Heen sent word to Trung that the boat would be ready in about a week. That evening, Trung and On secretly went down to Khao Noi to inspect the engine installation. If anything was unsatisfactory, Mr. Bay would fix it before the boat was launched into the small river in front of his house. After carefully inspecting every detail, Trung was very satisfied, and On praised him for selecting a powerful engine, even though Trung was not a professional in the field. All plans and schedules for boarding the boat were meticulously arranged by Trung. The large boat was camouflaged as a professional fishing boat, while the smaller boats carrying people and provisions were to be hidden under the mangrove and water coconut trees near the riverbank, close to the sea. After the boat was launched, Trung had everything, fuel, essentials, and provisions, loaded onto the boat, fully prepared. To familiarize themselves with the waterways, Trung, On, and Mr. Bay Heen frequently pretended to be fishermen, taking the boat in and out of the estuary a few times. The border police occasionally stopped them for inspections, but finding nothing suspicious and being familiar with Mr. Bay Heen, they let them pass without issue. The end day had arrived, coinciding with the communist authorities in Go Kong celebrating the liberation of the South. The provincial officials, engrossed in feasting and festivities, were a bit more lenient than usual, and Trung took advantage of this to move people with less fear of being watched by the local population or police. Around 9 p.m., Mrs. Hai informed Trung that everyone had boarded the small boats and was ready to depart for the rendezvous point as planned. On, the helmsman and mechanic for the trip, had already taken his family aboard the large boat since 6 p.m. Now On was at Mrs. Hai's house, waiting for the signal to set sail at the G hour. Thou, appearing anxious, clung closely to her mother. The suitcases of clothes and necessary items had been moved earlier in the day, leaving only a small handbag containing valuable gold and jewelry, which Thou was holding tightly. After a final check of the maps and nautical instruments, Trung looked at his watch and told Owen, "It's time. Take Mrs. Hai to the boat. Be calm, and watch out for the police. I'll bring Thou along in 5 minutes." Owen placed Mrs. Hai on the back of his bicycle as if nothing unusual was happening. A short while later, he disappeared down the road. Trung folded the small map, tucked it into his waistband, carefully locked all the doors in the house, and looked at Thou. "It's our turn now, Thou." At that moment, Thou was like an obedient little girl, following Trung's instructions like a student. She quickly stepped out and sat on the back of the bicycle, wrapping her arms around Trung's waist for support. The two of them rode together as if they were a couple out for a leisurely evening ride, unnoticed by anyone. About half an hour later, Trung and Thou had to dismount and lead the bicycle along the rice fields toward the riverbank. It was dark, but the faint starlight provided some guidance. Thou often had to hold onto Trung's arm tightly to avoid falling into the fields. Occasionally, they encountered irrigation ditches, broken by water buffalo, where the rising river water flooded in. Trung had to carry Thou in his arms to cross the ditches to keep her clothes dry. Despite the difficulties, they remained silent to avoid attracting attention. Soon after, they reached the riverbank, where Mrs. Hai and Owen were already waiting under a clump of nipa palms. Thou was overjoyed to see her mother again. Trung told Owen, "Now let's board the boat and head out." All four of them climbed into a small tamban boat that had been hidden there for several days. Trung took the bow, Owen the stern, while Thou and her mother sat in the middle. The boat quietly glided out of the canal, heading toward the river where the larger boat was anchored. It was past 10 p.m., and everything around them was silent, except for the gentle splashing of the oars in the water. A few herons, startled from their sleep in the mangroves along the canal, flapped their wings and flew away. A minute later, the small boat approached the side of the large boat, which was camouflaged with nipa palm leaves. Hearing the commotion, Owen's two eldest sons who were guarding the boat came out with flashlights. After recognizing their family members, they lowered the rope ladder for everyone to climb aboard. Trung had arranged a special spot on the boat for Mrs. Hai and Thou, where they could lie down and rest relatively comfortably. The newly built boat was quite large, with a powerful engine and fewer passengers than its capacity. The escape plan had been carefully studied, so Trung and Owen were hopeful that they wouldn't encounter any problems when navigating the estuary. The G hour for departure had arrived at precisely 1 a.m. Trung ordered the anchor to be pulled up and the mooring lines untied from the tree. Owen started the engine, which purred quietly. With just a quarter throttle, the boat smoothly glided across the calm water like a leaf floating along with the tide. Trung sat at the bow, watching for obstacles and keeping an eye on both sides of the river. Having practiced the route a few times, Owen was fully in control of the boat's direction. About 5 minutes later, on the right bank of the river ahead, a signal light blinked 4 times. Trung responded with 4 blinks of his flashlight and signaled Owen to stop the engine. The boat slowed down, and Trung lowered the rope ladders as 6 small boats hidden among the mangroves emerged, loaded with people. Children and the elderly were the first to be brought aboard, followed by young men carrying bags, suitcases, and food. Everything proceeded according to plan and schedule. At that moment, Trung, like a ship's captain, ordered everyone to sit still and remain as quiet as possible. Even the children's parents had to do everything they could, including covering their mouths, to prevent them from crying out, as this journey was a life-or-death escape between freedom and imprisonment for everyone on board. In no time, the boat reached the mouth of the river, where the tide was at its highest. Owen steered the boat close to the left bank, knowing that the right side of the river was lined with houses and a police checkpoint. It was nearly 2 a.m. The river, full of water, reflected the dim light of the distant stars, rising and falling with the boat's gentle waves. Fireflies flickered among the trees along the riverbank like ghostly lights. To maintain maximum silence, Owen kept the boat at half throttle. The engine hummed softly as the boat, carrying over 70 people and their provisions, glided steadily and smoothly. The bow of the boat sliced through the water like a sharp knife, splitting the surface into 2 equal parts. Now only the darkness surrounded them, and the only sound was the soft splashing of the water. The women held their children close, while the men, anxious, craned their necks to observe the surroundings on both sides of the river. Trung sensed the heavy, tense atmosphere weighing down on everyone. He left the bow and went to the stern to give Own final instructions. Keep the pace steady. When we pass the checkpoint at the estuary, if they don't notice us, we'll speed up afterward. But if they spot us and order us to stop, push the throttle to full and keep going. Trung also reminded everyone on board that when they passed the police checkpoint, they should lie flat on the deck because the boat would not stop and the police might shoot at them. Returning to the bow, Trung saw the lights from the police checkpoint about 200 meters ahead. He signaled everyone to lie flat on the deck. Own calmly kept the boat moving at the same speed, as if nothing unusual was happening. As they closed the distance, 100 meters, 50, 20, suddenly, a loud voice from the police at the checkpoint ordered the boat to pull over for inspection. Trung quickly jumped to the back of the boat, lying flat against the deck. Own pushed the throttle to full speed, causing the boat to lurch forward like a dinosaur, its bow rising high as it cut through the water like a naval speedboat from the old days. The bright searchlight from the checkpoint tracked them, and the sound of Alaska 47 gunfire rang out like New Year's fireworks. As a former soldier, Own knew well that from this distance, small firearms were only being fired in hopes of hitting the target by chance, not with precision. He calmly steered the boat, avoiding obstacles as they headed straight out to sea. A few minutes later, after they had put a good distance between themselves and the checkpoint, the AK gunfire ceased. Trung got up and, seeing no police boats in pursuit, checked that everyone was safe. He instructed Own to maintain their speed, setting a course east 90 degrees to avoid Coast Guard patrols, planning to change course toward Malaysia once they reached international waters for safety. The Vietnamese coastline gradually faded into the distance, becoming a faint black line on the horizon. The vast ocean stretched out before them, with waves gently rising and falling, making the boat seem small and fragile, like a bamboo leaf bobbing on a lake. Now there was no trace of land, only water and sky surrounded them. Trung estimated that they had reached international waters, and Own reduced the speed to half to ensure the safety of the engine. Occasionally, they saw large ships in the distance, brightly lit, passing by, but it was still too dark for Trung to determine which countries those ships belonged to. The first nerve-wracking hours of their journey had passed, and everyone, exhausted, found a spot to rest their heads and quickly fell asleep to pass the time until morning. With everything proceeding safely as planned, Trung entered the boat's cabin to check on Mrs. Hai and Thao, who were resting inside. As soon as she saw Trung crouching to enter, Thao quickly stood up, relieved, and took his hand. "Are you okay, Trung? I was so scared when I heard them shooting at us." Before Trung could respond, she continued, "Mom and I are fine in here, but we were so worried about you out there." Trung, trying to appear calm, smiled gratefully. He gently pressed her shoulder. "Thou, sit down, standing can make you seasick." He turned to Mrs. Hai. "We've reached international waters now. How are you feeling?" Mrs. Hai gestured for Trung to sit next to her. "I have a bit of a headache, but Thou brought a bottle of Nhi Thien Duong oil for me, and it helped." "Everything out there went well, didn't it?" Trung replied, "Yes, everything went as planned." Mrs. Hai continued, praising him. "You did well. Thou kept asking about you. She's really afraid of gunfire. Now that our family is all we have left, consider Thou as your sister. Don't call her Miss, it feels too distant." As soon as Mrs. Hai finished speaking, Thou eagerly chimed in. "See? You heard what Mom said, right? Calling me Miss all the time sounds weird. Can you just call me Thou?" Trung, feeling slightly bashful, lowered his head. "Okay, from now on I'll call you Thou. It's still dark outside. Why don't you and your mom try to sleep a little more? I'm going back out to relieve Own so he can rest." The sky began to lighten as dawn approached, with the stars fading and the horizon seeming to rise. The ocean breeze blew gently, enough to lull those lying together on the deck to sleep, as if they were in a cradle suspended by an invisible thread stretched between the two horizons. The splashing of long fish jumping out of the water, like dancers in a festival, was the only sound breaking the silence. In this vast emptiness, Trung suddenly thought of God. His God could be the sky, Buddha, or some other supreme being he couldn't quite imagine or identify, but he always believed that his God had the miraculous power to save everyone in their time of need. Just as when he was in the military, his mother would light incense and pray every night for God to protect him from harm. God was his mother's hope and his as well. We hope you enjoyed the excerpt from this chapter. The complete audiobook of The Last Flight Out by Nguyen Van Ba can be purchased on platforms like Google Play and others. Please subscribe to this channel for more content like this.